Hi, everybody. Okay, I guess that's loud enough. We'll get started. Welcome to Denver Startup Week, which I have been told is the largest free startup conference in the world, which is pretty incredible. You are here in the developer track, which is sponsored by Quizlet, and it's important for us to say thank you to all of our amazing sponsors who make it possible for us to have a free conference like this. And I'll say, other than the COVID times, I've been at Denver Startup Week since it started every year, and I think it's just an incredibly great opportunity for us to network, hopefully learn a little bit from each other. If not learn, then at least share experiences that we can both go, geez, that was a hard time. And so we're excited to be here and talk to you today about replatforming, a thoughtful approach to the biggest decision on your roadmap. Let's start with introductions. I'm Matthew Beckman. I'm currently the Chief Technology Officer at the Pros Closet. I have 24 years in engineering leadership. The vast majority of that time has been in startups. This particular topic is near and dear to my heart. Through startups, I think I've done 5 significant replatformings over the years. I'm a Denver, not native, but 15 years. And a few other things about me. And this is my co-presenter, Graham.
Yes, my name is Graham Batzler. I am a principal architect with a little bit of lead engineer sprinkled in at the Pros Closet. I've not been doing this quite as long as Matthew. You've got, 2.4% of a millennium now under your belt, so not quite there, but I've been focused on e-commerce for over a decade, and 4 of those years in Denver, so I'm very excited to be here presenting at Denver Startup Week. I'm also a gigantic geek about a lot of the technologies we'll be talking about here today, so I'll try to keep that restrained and us on the schedule. But with the flat, let's jump in.
So who's the Pros Closet? This is like the first joke we'll land. We're a startup that was founded in 2006. 16-year-old startup, it's okay, it's possible. We were founded really by the founder who was passionate about cycling. He's a professional cyclist, and he believed that cycles should be ridden. And what he saw was a lot of people buying bikes that were brand new and throwing them away or letting them gather dust because the industry really didn't have a solution to resell bikes except for on horrible places like Craigslist and Facebook. And the bicycles that we sell are fairly high-end. The low end of what we sell is about $3,000, and we sell bikes that are as expensive as $12,000. Imagine meeting somebody in a dark parking lot with $12,000 in cash, and you can imagine why we started this company. So in short, we buy used bikes from people, we put them through a refurbishment process, clean them up, fix what's wrong with them, get them back out on the road, on a trail, and under a rider where they belong without having to create new things. So we believe, again, in a lot of green and ecologically sound practices as part of our business. And as it's a great other story you could share that our founder started literally selling bikes out of his van down by the river. We've grown a bit. We now do about 2,000 bikes a year out of our facility up in Louisville. And here's a great way to get your mind around the scale of our operation. We've got about 180,000 square foot warehouse. That big picture on the left is our entire bike refurbishment operation. It's a highly operationalized serial line to bring bikes through, figure out everything that's wrong with them, and address it. Our warehouse, and we do a great deal of community service with Wish for Wheels and getting younger riders on bikes because we think that's great too. So let's talk about the technology setting and what Graham and I and the rest of the team have really been focused on for the last year.
Yeah, definitely. So this is, of course, oversimplified, but from an architectural perspective, when you're thinking about the tech systems at the Pros Closet, really the big funnel at the top there is how we get all our products. There are different metrics within that for determining which of these bikes are necessarily ones we want to buy versus ones we don't, but they all end up in our custom product information management system. And that's custom largely because bikes are fairly complicated. If you own a bike or have had to repair a bike, there's a lot of parts, a lot of measurements that have to be precise, and a lot of brands that are compatible or not. And so representing all of that made sense to build some custom software around. But realistically, we don't sell things out of our PIM. We have third-party vendors that we partner with. The one on the left here, of course, is NetSuite, which is represented pictorially by this lovely early 90s Toyota Camry station wagon. Certainly not the sexiest car on the lot, but if you put the adequate effort into it and maintain this integration, it'll get you from point A to point B, and it's pretty reliable as an ERP. The other portion here, though, is Shopify, and that's largely what we'll be talking about today, because that's our e-commerce SaaS provider. And this is represented pictorially by a Jenga tower. And I probably don't have to go into the cultural implications of that image, but certainly the platform that we built this on, I think 4 years ago, before Matthew or myself was involved with the company, it was a great opportunity for a small or medium-sized business to really bootstrap up that e-commerce portion. But as we've grown, we really bumped up against the boundaries of what it's capable of. And if we talk through some of those stack concerns, they sort of fit into 3 different buckets here. The first of which is the limitations in the stack itself. The ability to install a whole bit of functionality through an app store is really exciting when you're a small business and need to bootstrap out the e-commerce portion. But as you have more and more complex requirements and your business is larger and you have more of those apps overlapping, even just trying to figure out what's doing what and then augment that with your own custom systems becomes pretty complicated. As well as having a lack of control over our data and top-level domain. Something that's really exciting about Shopify is you can go into an admin user interface and you can build out something like a nav structure. But consuming that structure elsewhere is impossible. It is locked into their admin interface, and if you wanted to build something off of your Shopify infrastructure, but still have it on your, the proscloset.com domain, they also have full control over the routing at the level where you'd have to try and split that traffic across digital properties. So that's frustrating. We also spend a lot of time hacking around their limited data model. And again, not slagging Shopify here, they have a really good setup for products which can vary on one or more attributes. But when you have a very complicated data model with a lot of measurements and viewing a product as a collection of components, rather than a single thing that you merchandise, you end up working around a lot of that infrastructure and having to build your own stuff sort of on the side. And using custom tags or meta fields, if anyone's familiar with Shopify, works, but it requires a lot of overhead every time you're dealing with that and a lot of documentation on here's how not to shoot yourself in the foot using these practices. And then finally, site performance. You can build a performant Shopify site, it absolutely is done. But when you're a company that over years has outsourced a lot of that development to different contractors who are specialists and have their own opinions on things like camel case versus snake case versus Pascal case versus kebab case, and that's just our CSS, you run into issues with even navigating this stuff and knowing how to make those changes effectively. And that brings us to technical debt. The liquid templating language that Shopify uses was a fantastic invention built in Ruby in 2005. We're pretty far from Ruby and we're pretty far from 2005 at this point. So the speed of development, the lack of features in that templating language makes it frustrating for developers, as well as the sort of what I call the accrued cruft of having all of these templates and no real oversight of how they're organized or which of them are being used, and the naming conventions becomes really difficult to hack through the jungle just to get to the feature you need to touch. And then the fact that all of this is commingled, the things that are built directly in that platform and the things that we've built to try and escape it, even jQuery logic that's embedded in these templates, or like spinning up a React app that's fully client-side and then embedding it into one of these templates, you can see how this feels more and more like a Jenga tower, just trying to figure out which of those blocks to touch and not have the whole thing fall down. And then finally, paying some lip service to developer experience, which we'll be talking a lot about today. This idea that you train a bunch of React developers or hire people who are very confident and competent in their area of expertise and then sort of throw them back a decade or two and have them working in this technology is pretty frustrating and certainly not what we want to provide to developers at the Pros Closet. And then even getting this thing deployed is like a 10-step process of running local commands on your machine in order to reconcile certain differences between the admin interface and what you have in Git. And then there's really no opportunity for CI/CD at all when you have that process. So all of that to set Matthew up to talk a little bit more on the back of these concerns.
Yeah, you're probably asking yourself, why did these guys think they should replatform? This is pretty great. And I'll take a moment to point out, every startup has stories like this. Maybe yours doesn't. Maybe you're a founder and you're a CTO and you've made every right decision throughout the course of the business. I don't believe you at all. But we all inherit things that somebody else did. And I'll say, as Graham and I sort of mutually inherited this, central thesis, we have to fire Shopify. This is an unmanageable pile of cruft that prevents us from having any velocity or delivering any kind of an even baseline good e-commerce experience. But to build on kind of how we've been thinking about this, I want to take a moment and just sort of define terms, at least how we've been thinking about them. And these are three big words in engineering: culture, replatform, rebuild, refactor. And my own or our own sort of rubric for this, in terms of like, are we talking about refactoring or rebuilding or replatforming, are four basic criteria. The first is the blast radius. How many people are affected by the change that we're proposing? Is it just our team? That's a refactor. Is it the entire business? That's a replatform. What's the scope? Are we talking about like a chunk of a repo, an entire repo? Are we talking about every system that the business utilizes? Very correspondingly, how long is it going to take us to do that? Is this something we could do in a couple of sprints, or are we going to be at this for 16 months? And you can guess that risk tracks along both of those considerations as well. And so we very much started in that outer green circle, effectively certain we had to fire Shopify, and that was going to involve rebuilding the entire e-commerce platform for the business. It was going to touch every department in the business. It was going to take a really long time and come at significant risk. But we use this sort of rubric throughout our journey to try and keep ourselves honest about what we were talking about and the scope of what we might be signing up for as we evaluated any particular approach to these problems that Graham kind of set us up for. And that leads us right to the approach. How do we go about this? I'm going to lie and tell you the first thing we did is we wrote down the requirements. The first thing we did was we started talking about cool technology that we thought would be better than Shopify. And then after a few of those meetings, somebody, it might have been Graham, said, should we actually write down the requirements? And I shouted him down and said that was a bad idea. But he convinced me. And what we did here in a nice little scrolling GIF in Airtable is by functional area captured every single thing that we knew had to be true at the end of this process. And I say every single thing. You can appreciate not at an incredibly granular level, but enough that we had a line to represent the concern. And that enabled us then to evaluate a technology or a vendor or a combination of technologies or vendors and say, yep, that met that requirement, or nope, it's not gonna, or maybe it will, we're not sure. As the talk goes on, we're going to talk a lot about uncertainty because you're thinking about these things. You don't know the answer. You just have to sort of reason your way into, yeah, this is going to work or it isn't. But I'll say that foundationally, don't go down this road until you have captured all of the requirements across all concerns for whoever's impacted. Next, but actually first, we started talking about cool technology. And I think the bottom three on this list, security, scalability, and architectural fit, are the ones that as engineers we all just like go to. That's the easy stuff to think about, and it's super important. But I want to call out the top three: the technical maturity of a particular technology that we might be considering, the community around it, and reference implementations. As you are taking on a new thing, you're going to have questions. How do you get those questions answered? Who else can help you think about it? Are there patterns that you can pick up from and steal to make your jobs easier? These are really important evaluation criteria for technology. And this last green one, this call out, I really want to focus on for a second, and it's what I call the stretch. Like, just because you have a brilliant chief architect who could sit down and become proficient in any language I could throw at him, doesn't mean the rest of your team can. And you've got to be thoughtful about, if I'm going to introduce a new tool or a new pattern, can my team be successful at that? How long will it take them to achieve proficiency? Because that's going to lead to how long it takes you to get to the end of your road. And I think we were very mindful of this as we were talking about really cool new things that sounded great, but were a big stretch from some of the team that we had hired or that we were going to try to hire. So from requirements to candidate technology, of course, we also ended up talking a lot about vendors. And I'm going to get into a little bit of a vendor rant here in a second, but evaluation criteria here again, like how much does it cost? Most obvious. Size in market, I think, is a really important thing, and we're all in startups, so this is a little bit of a tough thing to contemplate. But if you're considering a vendor for something critical to your business, don't go with a startup that has 2 customers. There was at least one that we talked to that I'm fairly sure isn't going to make it to the end of the year, and that's very sad, but I'm glad we didn't make that choice because we would be in a particularly bad place as a result. I think this third bullet point is maybe the most important. If I'm going to go to a vendor and I'm going to give somebody money, how much complexity are they managing on my behalf? What does Graham and the rest of the team not have to do because we're paying those knuckleheads, whatever, $1,000 a month? And again, throughout the presentation and the talk, how much does any particular vendor solution align with the developer experience and the culture we're trying to create and our ability to attract interested, smart, and clever engineers? Here's my rant about vendors. Like, I grew up, maybe like many of you did, in an engineering culture that vendors are inherently evil, and that if you choose a vendor and they're down, now you're down, and it's your butt on the line. And if we do all of this stuff ourselves and something's wrong, we can fix it. We're not beholden to someone else. And there's wisdom in that thinking, but it also means that your team is now managing every single bit of that complexity, and that is, I think, its own stretch for a startup team that isn't practical and isn't wise. So are vendors really evil? Like, I think the answer is no, but you do have to think about that relationship. The dollars I'm sending out the door have to be offset by hours my team isn't spending dealing with that complexity or that particular subject domain. Vendors are always going to overpromise things. When we decide that we're going to go and write an accounting system, we're certain to encounter unanticipated complexity along the way, et cetera, and so on. And so it leads to a fundamental sort of tenet or belief for me, which is if you can't charge for it, if you're not getting value directly from your customers for the code you're writing, don't write that code. And that's a big thing to say. We could probably argue about it in the Q&A after, but it's a guiding principle for us as we evaluated technology, vendor, and ran that against our set of requirements. Last bit here, and this is probably, for me, the biggest learning across my 20-some odd years of doing this, is if you can't contextualize the effort, whether we're talking about replatform, rebuild, refactor, if you can't contextualize that with the rest of your business, stop and pause and wait until you can. The equation that I'm going to present for us to kind of contemplate is that your team's effort to replatform has to be less than or equal to the business's perceived value of what you're doing. Maybe you have found the coolest piece of technology in the world. It will cure cancer, feed the hungry, and end war. If your CEO doesn't get that, if your board doesn't understand that value, pump the brakes, because you're about to go down a road that is going to take a great deal of time, which is another way to say those investment dollars going to your engineers' salaries, that the rest of your business doesn't get. If I think about times that in my own career this has gone sideways, or anecdotes from others, it usually comes down to this. The engineering team went down a rabbit hole and the rest of the business wasn't along the road with them. So this was a huge criteria for us as we were thinking about, let's fire Shopify. Can we actually do that? And is that going to align with what the business thinks we're supposed to be delivering? So we kind of built this very basic equation. Constrained engineering resources, that's true for everybody. For us, if we're going to fire Shopify, cool, we've got to replace every transactional customer order fulfillment and e-commerce system in the business. We have to retrain our entire engineering team into a new set of technologies. We have to rewrite all of our internal admin interfaces and all of our integrations to whatever that new system is. And then we have to retrain the rest of the business on how to use those. My marketing team, my merchandising team, my operations team, my finance, my analytics team. It's a massive effort. And our business's perceived value here really didn't equal out, right? We needed, these are the things we're getting asked for, a better product display experience, much better search experience, better category filter and discovery experience, and of course, like every business, they wanted us to go faster. And so we had very high effort, offset by, medium, not nothing, but pretty mediocre business value if we're really going to say, let's fire Shopify. Graham, tell us what we learned as we got into this.
Yeah, that's what they're here for, right? So we talked a lot about the context of how we made this decision, and there's a lot that went into it. And I think there's a lot that came out of it as well. This is by no means everything we learned. There's a lot of details that are not represented here. But there are 4 slides here of things that I think are worthwhile takeaways if you're heading down this path, or even if you're starting a business and thinking, well, in the future, that could be me. So first of which is keep asking questions. And notice that's not phrased as ask questions, because because that's essentially table stakes. Keep asking questions. You have to collect your own data and understand what you're getting yourself into and how that stacks up against your business value that you're adding. But realistically, especially in vendor conversations, it's not a 100% trust-based relationship, right? There is some amount of salesmanship, there is some amount of, lack of communication and out-of-date documentation and things that you really do have to take upon yourself to verify that this is actually what you're getting if you sign up for this. And so having points of contact who, as Matthew mentioned earlier, are there reference implementations? Are there, third parties out there or communities that are able to give advice on this technology, this framework, this vendor, or at the company themselves? One of the things we found as we were talking with Shopify in particular was that we had much more productive conversations when we could pull a product person or an engineer into the conversation rather than the sort of point of contact we were assigned. And pushing for that person was not the easiest thing, but the conversations got way more productive when they were actually present. So finding a point of contact who can actually validate some of these vendor claims, whether it's internal or external, is pretty crucial. And then this point at the end here, get past that first answer. Because realistically, no matter who you're talking to about this, they have their own set of experiences that are going to color what they're telling you. And whether that's the vendor telling you things that, oh, this feature is on the roadmap, it'll totally be soon, don't worry about it, bro. Or it's someone in a forum who has sort of an overlapping experience that doesn't totally map onto what you're asking. Being able to dig past that stuff and get to something that gives you certainty around how your question is being answered is crucial. So keep asking questions. Number 2, prototyping is huge. That dovetails very nicely with the last one. One of the ways that you can really verify if something is going to work or not is to try building it. And especially if you're looking at very technical documentation that makes a lot of big claims and links out to a lot of discussion around these things, sometimes it's easier and quicker and more fruitful for you to just sit down at the keyboard and decide, okay, I'm going to scope out this one portion of this, I'm going to do a reference implementation myself, I'm going to see what problems I run into. And at that point, you open up 2 types of feedback. Your feedback for the vendor or for the purveyor of the technology, in which you can say, hey, your docs are wrong, or hey, this was way more complicated than it was sold to us. Can you explain that and give me some context and help me through this? But the other part of feedback as well is having a reference implementation makes those conversations with product or engineering folks way more productive. When you can point to something and say, this is not working, can you help me understand why this is not working? And having them, from the perspective of much more familiarity with that platform or technology, be able to give you feedback on your approach. And of course, independently verifying claims, trust, but verify is very huge. And really this process helps you prevent a lot of the surprises that, if you get 6 months into an integration and find out that it's really not going to work in a fundamental way for your business, you're in a real bad spot. So prototyping can help you identify the most crucial things to test and then build little tests against them to see how they really work. And then Matthew promised we'd talk about uncertainty. One of the big processes, I think, that we bootstrapped ourselves into and eventually came up with somewhat of a rubric for over time was this process of figuring out where do we need to be certain about this? Because we have a gigantic list of requirements and questions from the business and from ourselves. Where do we need to be certain? And where can we allow ourselves to be uncertain? Because certainly some feature that's on a roadmap in 3 years that you don't really see yourself needing in the immediate future allows you to have more uncertainty, but still overall be confident in the choice you're making. And so the process becomes collapsing that uncertainty where it does exist. And one of the big axes along which I'm thinking about this generally is how comfortable you are with that uncertainty. If you decide that I'm going to make this change to a payment system, and it turns out that your CFO isn't being consulted, you did not communicate with them about that, that's an area that you are way too comfortable with being uncertain, and being able to pull people in to help you determine how comfortable are we with this? Is this something we need to press them on? Is this something we need to build a prototype against? Framing the conversation around which of those things you must be certain about and which of them you're okay with figuring out as you go. And then finally, Matthew's bullseye presentation about rebuilding or refactoring or replatforming is sort of a helpful visual for this last one, scoping as a tool for managing that complexity. Because you're going to run into this uncertainty no matter what. And you're going to start with no answers and all questions, and the goal is to get to some healthy balance of questions and answers. And being able to scope the actual project to what level of certainty you're comfortable with is pretty crucial. And as you'll see as we keep going here, we landed in a place we did not think we would land on that bullseye that really helped us manage a good deal of the uncertainty that we might have otherwise had to take on if we landed in a different spot. And then finally here, one of the conversations that sort of was long running throughout this process was, if we commit to a vendor or we commit to a technology that does not have a very publicly facing positive image or doesn't have a community around it already, how is that going to impact not only our ability to hire talented, humble, dedicated people in the future, but retain the ones we have now? Because certainly committing to something like NetSuite going forward, you're only going to work on NetSuite forever, it's not a great sell for developers. And so thinking about the same question in that light, where we ended up landing and where, personally, this is my biggest takeaway from this entire presentation, but the idea that solving problems and understanding how to frame those problems and apply patterns of solutions to them is way, way, way more valuable. Like, I should have put extra crocodile mouths there. Way, way, way more important than any skill in a particular technology. And to date myself a little bit here, the analogy that comes to mind is when I first started, jQuery was the hot new thing. And if I had put my whole resume as jQuery expert and I'm all in on this technology, I don't know that I'd be here today, because that label is not the thing that actually carries the value. It's what you learn from working with that technology and how it can be applied to different types of problems. And in e-commerce, we have a lot of situations where understanding the type of problem and the things that can solve it is much more important than inventing the wheel again and again and again to solve the same problem of selling things on the internet. So don't have dogma around technology. Ultimately, it's pretty unhelpful and unhealthy for an organization to be really committed to this one has the name brand label, let's always go with that. Make sure you're choosing great high-level patterns, and I've said all of this in the very abstract, and we'll get in a moment into what some of those patterns are and why we went the path we did. But as long as you choose those patterns and make sure that is the guiding principle of how you choose tech, if the tech enables those patterns, you can then develop people's careers in really important and impactful ways without worrying about, is this Next.js, is this Gatsby, is this a homespun React meta framework? All of that is not nearly as valuable as, there we go, solving problems is way more important than any specific technology skill. So, with that said, I promised we'd get to some decisions. Here are some decisions. This is ultimately where we landed, which is to rebuild on Shopify. We did not fire Shopify. We continue to use them as a SaaS provider. They handle all of the payment and logistics and fulfillment things, order management, yada, yada, yada. But we're rebuilding on a new framework that they have, which I referenced Next.js and Gatsby. It is very much in that same camp, a headless opportunity to interact with their APIs but control our entire development stack. We started out at that Replatform place, and we ended up at Rebuild, which, scoping as a tool for managing complexity, you can see how that immediately removed the need to rebuild or find new vendors for like 12 different systems, and really helped us frame the rest of the problem going forward. We leveraged a bunch of different vendors, not just Shopify, and we'll get into some of those in a moment. But we're mindful the entire time of the developer experience that this was allowing us to build out in the future. A lot of these services that we ended up using are ones that enable pretty modern patterns of distribution and development, and again, I'm getting ahead of myself, we'll talk about this in the next slides, but developer experience being key through this whole process wound up at a powerful technology mix that we really think is going to be a stable foundation for a number of years to come, and allow us to hire and retain people kind of straddling that line. So with that said,
here's a little bit of an overview of the stack that we're getting to. And across the top, our shopping front end, our purchasing front end, our content front end, whatever those things are, happily can be nicely decoupled from the Shopify back end. We'll talk about a couple of the other boxes here in a minute, but a very different technology than we ended up starting with. The beginning slide of this probably should have just had a big picture that said Shopify on it, and we're building to something that's more complex, and we're going to get into what some of these look like. And this really is it. This is introducing new patterns. So while we're only rebuilding on Shopify, we're taking the opportunity to sort of replatform and bring in new technology that we think is pretty meaningful. And I think part of the goal of us for this talk is to talk about replatforming, but also you're at a tech talk at a startup conference. We should talk about some shiny new tech also. The first one of these that we're really excited about is a headless content management system. And if you have been in any way involved in managing content across digital channels, the problem of copying and pasting stuff from one system to another, or building ETL systems to make things go from one system to another, or having to refactor your front end because the back end changed, should be the kind of thing that makes you want to crawl out of your own head. And a headless CMS enables you to store content as discrete, related pieces independent of what the front end display pattern looks like, and then have that content consumed by whatever digital channel you care about, email, social, website, etc. We think and are excited about how this will fundamentally change, ultimately, how my marketing and our operations teams are able to talk about our products with our customers. It's going to make them more efficient, more reliable, and it's going to reduce all kinds of effort on the engineering team. The next one, which again, depending on your particular industry, may be really familiar and might be fairly new, is a customer data platform. I think we're all aware that when we're on the internet, every single thing we do is being monitored, watched, analyzed, and processed. And CDP essentially provides you one mechanism to capture events across any digital channel, to sort, organize, categorize, and then deliver those events to downstream analytical systems, personalization engines, recommendation engines, CRMs, or anything else, and very much aligned with our concerns to safely and responsibly manage the personally identifiable information that our customers share with us. This gives us one touch point for all of that governance. And I'll just contrast this with most of the other e-commerce businesses I've worked for. We've had 18,000 different pixels firing on every single page for every single marketing tool the marketing team has ever asked for. That's not so cool. I've now replaced that with a pixel, which is pretty great. Good engineering talks always include at least one absurd diagram. I won't talk you through this, but everything up here is all of the event systems. These two black boxes, illustrated that way for effect, are there we go. Our segment, our customer data platform, and then everything around the bottom here are the things that are interested in those events. And so we've got, I think, a fantastic net new way for us to manage events and deliver the kind of analytics that a good e-commerce company needs to personalize and drive recommendations for our customers.
Yes, this is my part. Okay, so I told you I was a geek about a lot of this stuff, and I told you that I would talk a little bit about some of these patterns. If you are involved at all in rendering out web pages, some of these terms may or may not be familiar to you. But one of the things that Hydrogen enables that we were really looking into, again, things like Next.js for, is the ability to remove a lot of the boilerplate involved in best practices like things like server-side rendering or statically generating pages, or even as this diagram on the upper right alludes to, the incremental static regeneration of being able to set cache lengths on your content such that once that cache expires, you've just automatically regenerated this page and it's already available without the client having to render anything. And then also this SSSR is streaming server-side rendering. The idea that really building out a whole page on the server and then sending it over is still sometimes better than client rendering, but being able to do portions of a page and then selectively rehydrate portions of the app while your server, which is more co-located with your data stores, is able to performantly fetch all of that is pretty exciting. And Hydrogen enables all these things. That's sort of this bottom left-hand diagram. Here is the general architecture. But it's not just about the rendering. It's the whole rendering pipeline, right? From data all the way to the server, and then how that gets rendered and delivered to the client. There's also this idea of per-route caching, where there are tools in this framework to specify on the page level, I want this page to be cached for this period of time, and to not have to like step to a different part of the stack to set your cache control headers or to like mess with your CDN. And being able to do that all from within this framework is pretty powerful. But again, it's not even just about the caching of the content, it's about the caching of the data between your data stores and your servers. Because being able to request, okay, customer information, which hasn't changed, without having to do another round trip, and intelligently doing that at the page or component level is really powerful. And I'll say more about this in the next slides, but edge rendering as well. This idea that you can certainly render on a server, but it's not cool to have your own bare metal anymore. You can render in the cloud, but the newer cool thing is rendering all the way on the edge so that the request takes the shortest possible trip from the client to the edge where it's server rendered and then returned immediately, instead of having to deal with any of your own orchestration of that stuff. Grab this guy. So some of the benefits here, of course, speed and performance, being able to decide when you're actually rendering these things or caching them is really powerful and provides, especially for e-commerce, where your site may not be the discovery mechanism. You might, through Google search, find a product, and then expect when you click through that product, it's going to load quickly. You're expecting Google-level experiences. Having speed and performance on our side is obviously a big benefit. SEO benefits, again, can't be understated. Not having to make the client build anything means that all your Lighthouse scores are much better. It means that you have full control over what's actually being cached, because you're the one who's saying, I'm rebuilding this just now, rather than whenever Google happened to hit your page last, as well as having granular control over this data freshness. And I get so excited about these things. I'm sure I'm breathlessly evangelizing here, but the idea that you, in a dynamic context, need to rebuild pages at a different cadence, or even rebuild portions of pages at a different cadence, versus something like a login page, where if you're iterating on your login page more than once a day, that's problematic, and I would argue probably more than once a quarter. But having different approaches for these pages and not feeling like, okay, I have a server, it needs to render everything, really powerful, again. And overall, developer experience through all of this, I mentioned that most of these things can be controlled within this meta framework, that you at the page level or at the component level can specify, I want this to be cached, or I don't want this to be cached. I want this data request to be cached or not. Making sure that all of this is not going to be overwhelming, and that these APIs are set up in such a way that people can step into this, understand the general concepts, and then be working with these powerful tools without feeling like they're overwhelmed by many portions of the stack all at once. And with that said, a little more geekery on this edge rendering here. Cloudflare Workers is how we're accomplishing this. And some of this is abstracted away inside Hydrogen, or rather inside Oxygen, which is Shopify's infrastructural DevOps style environment. But it uses Cloudflare Workers under the hood. And everyone knows, Lambda or Azure Functions or serverless generally, it's pretty nice to not have to maintain servers. But even going a step further and extending that server-side rendering to the edge, again, using physics to our advantage rather than disadvantage, make the shortest hop possible. But some things about the execution environment also drew us in. It claims a 0 millisecond cold start. I'm going to pause there for the impact of that. 0 milliseconds, which realistically, it may be a small number of milliseconds, but because Cloudflare is basically the whole stack, and Matthew knows so much more about CDNs, and we'll talk about this in a moment, they're able to do the initial spin up of this edge rendering worker during the TLS handshake. So it doesn't even take the entire request pipeline for it to start spinning up in order to service that request. It manages to do that even earlier. So they claim 0 milliseconds, but it is also expensive, or inexpensive. $5 for 10 million requests makes it pretty low cost to try out. It supports JavaScript and TypeScript. It supports Rust natively, anything you can compile to WASM, which is basically everything at this point. And another thing I'll point out, my career's been built on Node.js. I have no hatred for it. I think it's a great platform for a lot of things. But the idea that instead of having to set up an application which you deploy to a Lambda and which uses an Express framework or something to establish your routes and handle your middleware, these workers are built on the service worker spec, which means instead you take in an event, you do something with it, you return your payload. And the developer overhead of not having to think about any of the rest of that stuff, much less than deploying that to a Lambda and making sure it works in an environment that's not your local machine, is really exciting. And of course we have here this absolutely 100% serious statement about it being infinitely scalable. You totally will never run into any issues with that promise. And I will now stop my pseudo Cloudflare sales pitch and hand it over to Matthew.
Thanks. I'll really land how easy Cloudflare workers are. I'm 10 years post-technical, and I deployed one. But the last piece of technology we want to talk about is content delivery networks. And I am a bit of an evangelist on CDNs. Whether you like Cloudflare or not, This has got to be a part of your stack if you are in any kind of B2C business, and I think even in a B2B sense. CDNs enable you to cache content geographically close to the end user. That means your content loads faster, and it enables a resilience pattern because that content can be cached at the edge, that whenever your origin servers go down or aren't working or your interest a bug, your customers are still able to access your content without any of the downtime that you've just introduced by that pull request that Graham shouldn't have merged. It supports all kinds of content types. You get better delivery of bandwidth. Cloudflare particularly we like because it provides an edge security shield and an incredible way for us to manage the DDoS threat that I think we all ultimately live with. And all of this happens without anyone on our team having to do literally anything. It's just there and guards us while we sleep. And I think it's a fantastic pattern for everybody to be pretty aware of. Looping all the way back to one of our very early concerns with Shopify that Graham mentioned is in Shopify, our top-level domain, theproscloset.com, is fully and completely managed by Shopify. So if I want to build any application outside of the Shopify ecosystem and have it live at /blog, I can't, unless I introduce a pattern like a CDN, which enables me to terminate all of our SSL traffic at the edge. In that SSL termination, in the logic that we can build in Cloudflare, we can say, given any particular request pattern, do something with it, television, including send it to Hydrogen, which is sitting on top of Shopify, send it to some React Native app that we built, send it to something in WordPress, whatever else we want to do, we get the granular control of routing at the edge and all of the benefits of a CDN and all of the benefits of serverless rendering on the edge for all the performance reasons. It's something we're really obviously pretty excited about. And I think like wrapping up all of this other new patterns that we've built, what's great about these is that we're able to introduce these iteratively. If you go all the way back to my big concentric circles of refactor, rebuild, and replatform, in a replatform sense, I've got to make everybody wait. There's like a really long time period before we're done and we throw the switch and the new thing is live. And the business doesn't love that because they're not able to enjoy the value of what we're changing. But with these technologies and the approach that we've landed on in our story, we're able to do this iteratively and bring these technologies online as part of regular sprint cadence. And so we're able to incrementally deliver that value that the business is so excited for. And that actually gets us happily to the end of our ride together. And I want to land you on a couple of key takeaways. Hopefully you've enjoyed the conversation. But these are the things that I think are the most important learnings for us. And first, maybe this doesn't need to be stated, but I'll point out that when we started this conversation, we were talking about all the cool technology for a while before we actually said, what are we trying to do? Understand your needs and your goals and the needs of your business. Understand the many dimensions of choice. If you're thinking about a technology, a vendor, a combination of technologies and vendors, how's that going to work with your team and how is it going to serve your business? Become uncomfortable with uncertainty. At some point, as you're contemplating any of those R's, you're going to have that joyous moment of sitting down, maybe with your boss, maybe with your CTO, maybe with your CEO, maybe with your board. And they're going to look at you and say, can you do this? And in the back of your mind is a little voice screaming, are you kidding? No, we have no idea what we're doing. I've got a whole list of stuff. I have no idea how it's going to work. But you've got to be able to say, yeah, we've got it. And you've got to be able to get enough, comfortable enough with uncertainty by collapsing it through prototyping, asking additional questions, independently verifying claims, that in that moment you can say, yeah, we got this, and we're going to do the right thing by you, the business, and by our team, so that we can ultimately get the developer experience that we want. And that gets me, I kind of skipped this last one, but tightly coupling effort and perceived value is how you don't get out of line once you've made that promise to your CEO or your board or whoever. That is the end of our talk. I want to pause before I open it up for questions because I meant to mention, as any good engineers, we brought a bunch of swag at the back table. There are stickers, suntan lotion, water bottles, and other The Pros Closet branded paraphernalia. You're welcome to have all of it. We're going to rebrand in a little bit, don't tell. So take all of it because we're not going to use it. I'm Matthew at theproscloset.com. This is Graham at theproscloset.com. We're, of course, hiring. If you're interested in talking to us about that and joining us for the ride, we're happy to do that afterwards too. But if you've got any questions or comments, we'd love to hear them. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. Instead of yelling. I have a, oh my gosh, that's loud. I have a question about kind of comparing the, let's say, cost of replatforming versus the business perceived value, right? And I feel like the cost of replatforming is both the effort from engineering side, but also the potential stagnation of a product, especially if that is your IP, right? Like, let's say the product is actually what you're selling. That then can become fairly costly if there's, let's say, a year of stagnation to replatform. And I feel like that side of it is a bit more straightforward in terms of measuring, but